What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a follower of Christ? And I think if we spent much time unpacking that, somewhere along the way, it would come to a point of conversation about what our identity is. And in that identity, probably quickly, there would come up the topic of grace and love and forgiveness. Grace, love, and forgiveness are essentials for a time of pressure and time of crisis because they open up opportunities. The church in the United States and in the West is kind of living in that kind of time, a time of crisis and pressure and also opportunity. We're living in a time where the philosophy of the age is sort of turned towards secularism, and so as a result of that, we're not getting our young people coming back to church. There's been a decline in religious belief throughout the West. The nuns, not literally religious nuns, N-U-N, but N-O-N-E, meaning non-affiliated Christian people, are highly on the rise, while folks affiliating with the Christian church are on the demise or the decline. And yet, on the positive end, the opportunity end, that's the threat and the crisis and the challenge and the pressure. On the opportunity end, what I'm seeing kind of happen in the church is a focus on understanding who we clearly are as Christ's children and how we should operate in the world. You could say that the church in America is in a time of pressure and crisis and also a time of opportunity. Now, we know that the Gospels were written, the 4 Gospels that we have, were written to specific communities, meaning they weren't just written to the church in general. They had no idea that we'd be here 2,000 years later and that they'd be writing to a congregation that was started in Westlake Village and now is in Agoura Hills or Bakersfield or somewhere in Ohio or Kentucky. They were writing to a specific group of people for a specific need. And they ordered their Gospels in such a way that it would point out lessons to them in what they needed. And the times in which Matthew's community was living is similar in the sense that there was a time of crisis, a time of pressure, but also a time of opportunity. Now, their crisis and their threats or pressures were far different than ours. The Gospel of Matthew is written, they think, in the city of Antioch, and it was written after the Jewish war. What that means is that Rome has already destroyed the temple and the city of Jerusalem, and on that mountain where the city was, they were beginning to rebuild another city that wasn't called Jerusalem. The Romans would call it something else. It was a long Latin term, of course. And that Israel itself was no longer termed Israel. It was the Romans who called that region Palestinia. The Jews were dispersed throughout the kingdom. If they survived the Jewish war, they were enslaved and sent all over the kingdom. It's one of the reasons why you have Jewish neighbors today. You can thank Caesar for that effect in terms of the Jewish community and their focus on synagogues rather than temple. The Jews weren't allowed to enter the new Roman city that was sitting on the ruins of Jerusalem. Rome had lost its patience with the Jews. They were dispersed. Many refugees, slaves throughout that Roman Empire. There was real pressure on Jews and Jewish identity to toe the line of Roman expectations, of Roman ideals. No longer was there freedom that had been arranged in an alliance between Julius Caesar and the Herod family. Those alliances were gone. There was no longer Jewish freedom to be religious. They had to be in Roman religious practice, not Jewish ones. And within the context of that, the early Christian community found itself oftentimes settled still within the Jewish synagogue gathering were groups of people who confessed Jesus as Lord. Now, it's hard for us to imagine any of us living within the context of a synagogue, but we also aren't that attached to Judaism as we were in the first century. The pressure that was on the Jews and the persecutions to toe the line to Jewish ideas and Jewish religion was applying equally, if not more so, to Christians who were also being hushed up about that Jesus stuff in their synagogues. Questions must have been filling their minds. How could Jesus be the Messiah? How could he be initiating the Messianic age when God's people seem to be suffering from defeat after defeat? The temple is destroyed, only one wall left standing. The city of Jerusalem is gone, and now no religious liberty in which they are free to practice. And it was dangerous. to have a sharp identity, a distinct identity, apart from Rome and apart from Judaism. The story takes place in the city. It says that Jesus entered a territory or district called Caesarea Philippi. How many of you, did that strike you? Oh, they're in Caesarea Philippi. Absolutely no one. Of course, why is that? Because we don't know where that is. It could be Bakersfield, it could be Las Vegas, it could be London. We don't know what the context means. But it's one thing for us to talk about living in Agoura Hills, and it's a different thing to talk about living in Las Vegas, isn't it? Or Amsterdam. It conjures images, and that's why Matthew tells this story about Jesus going to the district of Caesarea Philippi. Who's this area named after you? Caesarea. Caesar. Okay, it's 25 miles northwest of the Sea of Galilee. It's right on the edge of Gentile territory, and it's a Roman-named town or colony that's there, named after who? Caesar. Over the period of history, Jewish history, there have been temples in that place to Baal, who we understand from the Old Testament as a competing god to the God of the Israelites, to Pan, which is probably somebody that you don't know too much about, which is just as well. And now there is a temple to Caesar himself. So we have a community that's under a lot of pressure, that has faced a huge crisis, and now Matthew's telling them a story about a politically and religious mixed district that they would have understood. It would have been like saying what happens in Caesarea Philippi stays in Caesarea Philippi. It is a place that has an understanding, that is religiously mixed, it's been compromised, and it's in this context that Matthew puts this story of the confession of Jesus. That Peter, when asked the question, "Who do you say I am?" answers with this definitive great confession: "You are the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." And it impresses Jesus. Rarely do the disciples impress Jesus, so we should always make note when the disciples impress Jesus. Jesus says, "Flesh and blood hasn't shown you this." Meaning, in other words, book knowledge isn't here. This is inspired by the Spirit. My Father in heaven has given you this information. Matthew's church, the church who is receiving this story, has suffered. Many have died in the war with Rome, called the Jewish War. Almost all were displaced by Rome. Most of us have not suffered in the monstrous ways in which this community of Matthew has suffered. Some of us do. Some of us have monstrous things that have happened to us of a completely different nature, but monstrous just the same. And those things, those terrible things that can happen to us, they can challenge our faith, can't they? In fact, the difficult things often can shape us. Have you ever met someone who's embittered? Everybody's like, yeah. The bitterness of the pain has shaped their life. Our passage for today is an answer to that question. How am I supposed to have my faith, and what is the shape of my faith supposed to be? Matthew's answer, given through the mouth of Peter, is that it should be a bold confession that Jesus is Lord. Now, it seems a little odd because Matthew will link this understanding of confession, of our orthodoxy, our statement of faith, to suffering, and to a third thing, forgiveness. We don't get it so much this week, but next week, if you come back, we're going to pick up right where we left off in our gospel reading, and he's going to talk about, Peter gets it right here. He says, who do people say that I am? And Peter gets it right. He gets the A star for the day. But next week, Peter's going to get completely wrong, and Jesus is going to say, great answer about the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now here's what it looks like. I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be rejected by the elders. I'm going to be persecuted. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to die on a cross, and 30 days later, I'm going to die. And what does Peter say? Absolutely not. Not while I'm on watch. And Jesus says, you didn't do so well on that test. In Matthew's gospel, he's linking this confession to suffering. And suffering and this confession of faith to the force of forgiveness. How do we know that? The second part of that is, at the end, it says Peter gets affirmed. Rather than a star of the day, he gets his name changed. Instead of being Simon Slippery Sands, sinking sand, or soupy sand, he's Petros. He's the rock. We're going to go to Petra next spring. Petra is a city built completely in rock. Petros. That's Peter now. Instead of Simon sinking sands, he's the rock. He's solid. And Jesus says, I give you the keys of the kingdom. Have you ever heard of that term before? The keys of the kingdom? If you've gone through confirmation, you've heard something about it. You can look it up in your book because the catechism is actually in the red hymnal, and you can look up the keys of the kingdom. Traditionally understood is the power of the church altogether, or particularly priests, if you're Roman Catholic, to forgive or to withhold forgiveness. It's the power of the church to forgive or withhold forgiveness. Forgiveness is key to understanding who we are as Christians, right? Forgiveness is central. Jesus, from the cross, asked God to forgive those who are crucifying him. Jesus teaches us to pray, and one of those phrases that we continue to repeat around the world today when billions of Christians are saying the same prayer you're going to say in a little bit is to forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Forgiveness is a part of how we understand what happens on the cross. Central to our understanding the exchange that happens on the cross is critical to our understanding of being forgiven by God. Critical to our understanding of the whole Christ event, why Jesus had to come at all, was for the forgiveness of sins. And where there's forgiveness of sins, there's also life and salvation. So forgiveness, this reconciliation with God, is a key part of the narrative of the New Testament. It is central to our understanding about who Jesus is and what he does, and therefore what we're to be about, what Matthew's community was to be about under the pressures and crises and opportunities of their time, and what you and I are to be about under the crises, pressures, and opportunities of our time. We live within God's gracious movement of forgiveness, which is the story of salvation. Grace, of course, is God's unmerited favor. What's it linked to? Forgiveness. We're forgiven for things that we didn't deserve forgiveness for, but grace has it covered. For Matthew, those in Matthew's congregation, those who suffered loss of property, perhaps those who were grieving the loss of life in the war, who had become refugees, who lived under the hardship and discrimination for their faith, forgiveness must have been a tall order. Must have been hard for them to grasp. Like those who survived the genocide in Rwanda or apartheid in South Africa. Forgiveness must have seemed like such a flimsy and unreliable tool in which to move into the future. But interestingly enough, for Rwanda and for South Africa, confession and forgiveness were the very tools that they utilized to be able to move their communities into the future. The Truth and Reconciliation Councils in both of those nations used the Christian practice of confession and forgiveness to restore. I heard a speaker once talk about how widespread the violence and murder and bloodshed was in Rwanda, that they could never possibly build enough prisons to house everybody that was involved in the genocide. There were over 1 million people killed in Rwanda, over 250,000 women raped during that short period of time of the genocide. There was not enough possibility to build a prison to hold all those people. So how would their nation restore themselves? How would they move into the future? It wasn't by penal codes. It would be by confession and forgiveness. They set up two types of courts. One was the penalty court for the severe offenders, and then there were those who got caught up in it. And those who got caught up in it and committed crimes, even heinous crimes, could go to the reconciliation court, and before their victims, they would admit the full truth of what they did and beg for forgiveness. And the victim was given the opportunity to know the truth and to offer forgiveness. And that's how Rwanda, and that's how South Africa are nations moving into the future. For those who are living in Ferguson, Missouri today, or the family of the slain journalist this week, forgiveness probably seems out of reach. For those who are seeking refuge on a mountaintop or in a desert in Iraq following unspeakable violence and bloodshed from ISIS, forgiveness must seem impossible. And for some of us here today, suffering silently from abuse or infidelity or betrayal or injustice or some other malicious acts, forgiveness may not even be what we want. We may want to feel the empowerment of our anger or the satisfaction of our vengeance. But those things, as good as they feel in the moment, cannot break the cycle of victimization and violence. They cannot release us from our pain, nor will they release us from the perpetrator of our pain. For that, you have to have forgiveness. Matthew's church in that first century in Antioch, living after that horrendous war and all of its consequences, had been witnesses of the power of God to raise Jesus from death to life, something else that was seen as impossible. They knew the power of God's grace to change lives, and they knew the force of forgiveness to reshape reality in Jesus' name. We, as the 21st century church, are encouraged to see and believe in Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and to form our lives around his and around his way of life. Peter gets it right. There's a confession and a form in which that confession takes, and that form is a matter of life in which we live into him. But we worry about forgiveness, don't we? We all do. Whenever I talk about forgiveness, I am sure that it applies 100% to the congregation. If I want to talk about any other topic, if I want to talk about football, I know it's going to be a fragment of the congregation that's into that. If I talk about baseball, a fragment of the congregation that's into it. If I talk about leather purses, it's only a fragment of the congregation that can get into that. But if I talk about forgiveness, 100% of people are into it because they understand that they need to forgive and they need to be forgiven. It applies equally across the board, and we're worried about it, aren't we? Some of us have been living with a lack of forgiveness, and the price has been high for most of our lives, but we continue to pay the price because we're worried about what forgiveness might mean. We worry that forgiveness would make us vulnerable again, like somehow we'd let our guard down if we let forgiveness come. Or we worry that it doesn't mean that we should seek justice along with forgiveness, but those are two different things. Forgiveness doesn't mean that we don't seek justice. We worry that forgiveness opens us up again to an abusive relationship, but forgiveness does not necessarily mean reconciliation with the one who abused us. Forgiveness is a special thing. And so I want to use some quotes from Desmond Tutu, who's the Archbishop in South Africa, is the Nobel Peace Prize winner, clergyman and the chair of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Committee, who writes about forgiveness. He says, "If I slap you after you slap me, the slap I give you does not lessen the slap that you've given me. I feel it on my face, nor does it diminish my sadness to the fact that you've struck me. The only way to experience healing and peace is to forgive. Until we can forgive, we remain locked in our pain and locked out of the possibility of extending and experiencing healing and freedom, locked out of the possibility of being at peace." Jesus speaks of the force of forgiveness as the keys of the kingdom. Quite an image, isn't it? Think about what I talked about with the kids today. You have a pocket full of keys just like I do. I have 2 sets of keys. 3, actually. There's my car key, which gives me special access to a vehicle. And then there's a whole set of keys over here that are the church keys. This is the all-access key, except it doesn't access everything. This is a mailbox key, and this is a cabinet key, and this is a separate cabinet key, which I don't know what that's for, and this is some other cabinet key. You have them too. Keys. Lots of keys. And on the other end of the ring is keys to my house and other membership club keys that help me get access to benefits, right? You have them too. They're probably on your key ring in your purse or pocket right now. What does it mean to have a key? A key fits a lock. A key means that I get to work in this building and I get to enjoy what this building has to offer. That's what this key means. It means I have access. Dallas Willard, who is a philosophy professor at USC and a Christian writer, said, "Having the keys of the kingdom," he said, "is not a matter of controlling access to the kingdom, as has been often thought, whether or not we give or don't give forgiveness. Keys do not mean the right to control access. A key means enjoyment of access. Imagine," he says, "a man who carefully kept his doors locked to his house and his keys in his hands, but he never went in his house because it was safely locked. It makes no sense. Having access to the kingdom, living in it, is what matters. In other words, confession of faith is Jesus is Lord. And then what it means that he's Lord. What is he Lord over? And in this case, he links confession of faith to the force of forgiveness as a formative action of the Christian life. Desmond Tutu again writes, without forgiveness, we remain tethered to the person who's harmed us. We're bound in chains and bitterness, tied together, trapped with them. Until we can forgive the person who's harmed us, that person holds the keys to our happiness. That person will be our jailer. Think about that. Is that how it works for you? As I thought about this message, I thought about people in my childhood who now have surfaced on Facebook. Oh, I hate that person. And what immediately, as soon as I don't recognize their faces anymore, because like me, they're getting old. But I recognize their name, and immediately it went back to a wound, to an episode, to a moment, a bad moment, a misspoken, a malicious word, a malicious action, and it took me immediately back there, even though I don't know them, and I haven't seen them for 35 years, and yet I am tethered to that experience and that wound because I'm tethered to them because I lack forgiveness. Tutu says, when we forgive, we take back control of our own fate and of our own feelings, and we become our own liberators. Forgiveness, in other words, is the best form of self-interest. This is true both spiritually and scientifically, he writes. We don't forgive to help the other person. We don't forgive for others. We forgive for ourselves. In other words, it's wrapped up in our identity. It's about who we are as God's children. Matthew wanted his church to understand how to face the difficult times that they had already encountered, the chaos and the stress and the pressure and the crisis, with a clear identity of belonging to Jesus the Lord, and a clear understanding of what it means to follow him in suffering and in hope with the love in this world called forgiveness. He links these ideas of identity and suffering and forgiveness because he wants us to understand that in the midst of whatever you have suffered, whatever wound you bear, God stands with you in it and bears that wound as well, and longs for you to be free from it, liberated from the sorrow and suffering because Christ is with you. To do this, God uses the force of forgiveness and helps us understand the cross and the whole Christ event is about forgiveness and reconciliation, not just between us and God, but between us and other people, between the church and the world, between us and society. And it is our distinctive place as God's children in the world, as the people who confess him as Lord, Messiah, Son of the living God, to take up the second part of how we will live that out and to live in the force of forgiveness. Why would we not help others to find the keys that we have found and to help them live into the freedom of the one who gives us life, not just now, but forever?